This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better. I'm Jessica Morrison.
And I'm David Blaney.
Today we're talking with Professor Greg Morrison, the director of the Curtin University Sustainability Policy Institute, about the future of climate action. The Paris Agreement, which aims to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century, came into force 3 years ago. Professor Morrison, are we on track to save the world?
I think we have every possibility to do that. And I think some of the research we're doing at our institute has for many years been aiming to save the world, if you like, and to make sure that we keep within the planetary boundaries, within the limits that we should be living within. However, that said, I think there's been a big change in the way that we've been looking at the environment and climate. I'd like to sort of step back a little bit to when I was a 15-year-old boy. I was at a library in Kent, and I saw a little notice up on the board, and it was from a local preservation society. I called them up and I started going along to meetings. This was really on the back of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the environmental movement that resulted in the 1972 Stockholm Conference. A lot about sort of acid rain and the issues of that time. And that was what environment was. It was about understanding how we're affecting our ecosystems and the large-scale use of pesticides. I found that very interesting. Eventually moved into university, lived in Sweden for 30 years. I've worked with environmental issues, particularly about sustainable development. More recently, we've had another 15-year-old person come along in Sweden, a young lady called Greta Thunberg, who sat outside the Swedish government for a number of weeks, a Friday every week, and carried out a climate strike. The interesting part of this was that although she has learning difficulties, she'd gone in and looked at everything about climate change and tried to set herself into it. And she really has one very key question. If we know so much about it, then why have we done nothing about it or not enough about it? I think the interesting part of this story is that she's raised an awareness amongst the 15-year-olds and above, a generation who have quite a different way of looking at environment from what I did. They are concerned that we're just not doing enough. At this present time, there's about 16 national governments who declared an environment and climate emergency. First out was Britain, a government who has spent 3 years not agreeing on Brexit, is suddenly able to make an agreement very, very quickly that there is an environment and climate emergency. Here in Perth, Fremantle have taken a stance on this issue. So there's a movement there that is very important for the next generation.
They are the future. They are the future of this climate action.
Then the question is what we're doing. I'm putting the question into your mouth. The question is what we're doing about that. And I think that's where we are today, is trying to make sure that we're taking sufficient action.
Are we? What are we doing?
We've got 2 areas that we're taking action. The first one is by looking at actual cities themselves and saying cities is where most of us live in the world today, and urban living will continue to be the big issue. I'm involved in an organisation called the Climate Kick, which is a knowledge innovation community. It exists in Australia, across Australia. It also started and exists in Europe, has some of the best universities in the world involved in it, and has as a simple aim, has quite a lot of funding behind it from the European Union. Here in Australia, we find other sources of funding, but we're working very hard with it. The interesting thing is that pushed on by this environment and climate emergency, or enabled by that, we're starting to sort of redefine the way we're looking at the research we do. We're doing a lot of good research in the White Gum Valley, looking at solar battery storage. We're doing a lot of good research in terms of creating living labs, working with companies. But the question is that enough? So what we're starting to look at now is how do we take that research base that we have? We've done a lot in terms of understanding climate and climate action. How do we take that research and turn it into a very tangible transformation process?
I suppose that's for, people listening to this podcast. Some may appreciate and understand the concern that we, looking to the future of the climate, but think, what can I do really? Like what can they do tangibly at home or in the workplace to actually improve these outcomes?
There's a lot we can do at home, in terms of recycling and in terms of energy use and water use. The reason we're starting to look at Perth at a much bigger scale is because of the difficulties of just doing it at home. We know that Perth as a city, it has some real benefits. It's very sunny, and the people in Perth have been putting a lot of solar energy on their roofs and have done an awful lot in pushing it in that direction. That creates all sorts of problems in terms of the grid, in terms of the energy services. But Perth is one of the first places in the world to really be moving towards a renewable future. So there are things that people are already doing today. But I think it's at scale that we need to be able to help people. It's not enough to expect everybody to take individual, and some do and some don't. The scaling we are planning to do with the European cities, and this is where it really starts getting interesting, because European cities have their own characteristics. So a Copenhagen, which is a lot of cycling, which is a different type of society, differs greatly from Perth, which is
lots of driving.
Absolutely, the city looks quite different in terms of transport, but also it has a resource base which has a substantial carbon footprint. I think what we need to do is put a positive frame onto this and say, how do we actually transform the city of Perth together with 10 other cities in Europe, which are being selected at the moment, together with Sydney? And how do we show what can be done in terms of creating, for 2030, a prosperous, inclusive, climate resilient, net zero emissions Perth? I think that's the type of response at scale that we can give to the next generation, because if we don't do that, it won't happen.
It's so great to hear you speaking about it in such a positive tone, because I think far too often when we hear in the media about the climate, it's very doomsday, it's very bleak. And obviously, if we don't take action, it is. I just think it's very refreshing that you're speaking about the future in that sense, because I think, as you said, we need to sort of encourage the future generation, being those 15-year-olds now, to take action.
I think that the thing for me is that I see much more potential in this. What we're planning to do now, just to give a little bit of idea of how we're going to do this, we're going to start at Curtin. We're going to start going through all the research we do that meets that vision that I just mentioned in terms of Perth, gather together the researchers. Universities are cooperative places, but often academics are working in their own little rooms, and we need to sort of pull together over a bigger vision. We're going to work in across Curtin to gather together our capacity, start to bring the other universities into this, start to look at it in terms of the actual money we put into this type of research already, which I think is starting to look at 500 million to billion, and starting to say, well, how do we then lift that together with companies, together with the state government and the LGAs, and start to engage and say, well, how do we create that into a much bigger project? This will be done in the European cities, 10 of them, and in Sydney at the same time. In my career, I've been involved in a couple of quite similar sort of projects, and it's surprising how this type of idea gains traction. And I think it's what the universities are there for, is to provide the ideas, the understanding, the contemporary knowledge to be able to meet this challenge.
How much time do we have left to prepare ourselves for more adverse weather events and, more importantly, to prevent climate change from getting worse?
Well, that depends on who you speak with, about the optimists and the pessimists. I would say that part of that vision for the future is climate resilience. So there's two aspects to this: mitigation. So of course we have to continue to sort of look at the way we're going to reduce CO2 emissions. We've also got to realise that this is a very challenged place on Earth, and we have to make sure the resilience of the city is sufficient. A lot of this comes down to the people with less included and with less money can live in homes that have an adaptation to longer periods of heat and even cold. It's quite cold in the homes in Perth, which I found to my surprise when I first came here. So how do we, that I think is an important part of it. Inclusivity and climate resilience are an important part of that. I think what Greta and the movement have been saying is we need to do it now. I wouldn't fully agree with what she says that, we haven't necessarily done enough. I think we've done an awful lot, but I think there's an emergency or a crisis to it that we need to react to. Looking at it from a global perspective, if we're able to carry out this type of project that moves to 2030, I think that is a reasonable response with the present where we are today.
What does the term climate emergency mean? Was the term climate change not cutting through? Were we all just sort of thinking, it'll get a little bit warmer, when in fact it means that we are going to have more floods, more adverse weather events, more natural disasters?
Yeah. So this was sort of what I was trying to say earlier, that I think we've moved from a time where environmental science, preservation, conservation was big. The 60s, with the DDT and the acid rain and and I've sort of seen that progression in my career to more around 87, where you had the Brundtland Commission and sustainable development. Now, the interesting part of that was that the academic world, when that really got to the Rio conference in 92, the academic world sort of reacted a little bit slowly. We sort of discussed for quite a long time, well, this is sort of sustainable development. It's like a political vision. And what does that really mean in a university? And should we react to it? And it took about 10 years to really get going, to be honest, and to understand that sustainable development is something quite fundamental to our future and bringing in the sort of social context. I think the difference this time is that there's been a sort of a change in meaning in terms of, so we're not just talking about a climate crisis, which is what you're referring to, but environment and climate. In other words, it's the biodiversity, our planetary boundaries that are being exceeded. I think the difference is that the message is so stark and so real. From my experiences, there's no reason why we should be waiting for this to happen. We need to be working on the solutions and just taking up the challenge. And for goodness sake, that it took a 15-year-old child to tell us that, I'm almost ashamed. But we get it. And I'm starting to see quite a lot of universities through the world that are reacting in a much quicker and a much different way. So I guess going back to your question, what is the difference about this? Well, I think the difference is that at the present time, the environment and climate emergency becomes if you like, a symbolic, not particularly legally binding agreement to do something in policy. I think that's a great start. You have to start somewhere. Nobody's expecting you to legally bind governments immediately into something without spending some time sort of working out what to do. I think at the same time, that symbolism and that message is something we can all attach to. And I think this was always the idea behind these movements, was to get us to wake up a little bit and start doing something.
Going back to what you were talking about before, the project that you're working on in Perth, the Global Cities transformation in Perth, and also Sydney and the other European cities. You mentioned earlier that will help to encourage climate neutrality in our cities. Can you explain how we're going to do that in the future?
If we just briefly go back to some of the research we've been doing in Fremantle. So we've been looking at solar storage systems, so looking at how we can introduce batteries, and batteries are going to be a big part of our sort of energy future. We've been carrying out projects. The Whitegum Valley is one, lots of prizes, very important for Landcorp, very important for Western Power and Synergy as the grid owner and the retailers. And it's sort of, there was always a sort of an idea that somehow this could spatially gradually move into new developments. And look, that's fine. And that's the sort of work we do. So we've done a lot of good research on that. We've also been carrying out research and looking at peer-to-peer trading of energy across the grid. It was one of the first in the world. But it's very much local or limited in what it is in terms of space and in terms of time. I think the difference with a climate emergency is we need to start looking at ways of saying, okay, we've done a lot of this great research. How does it get scaled? I think the difference here is that what we're trying to do is to say, well, let's bring together all the research we do so that it's not disjointed and a bit
not
here
siloed.
And there. Yep. And then bring together particularly the local government authorities that are very progressive. Just to name a couple that we work with, Fremantle, Bassendean, Joondalup we started working with, Canning. There's a few of those sort of LGAs that we know are really trying both politically and in other ways to show what they can do. You'll see it if you look at the ones that have moved into the 3-bin system the fastest, they're the ones that are moving quickly. The change in the way that we recycle, you're reusing materials, sort of a whole circular economy sort of thinking behind our energy, water, waste, metabolism. The key thing about the transformational part is bringing all those stakeholders together and starting to track and to infuse the other stakeholders and to bring in more people who feel that they want to join this type of project, who feel that the environment and climate emergency is important, are prepared to invest money into it or are prepared to invest time into it. And that will be different from the different stakeholders, what they can and can't do. I think without that type of process, then we will tend to remain at very nice research ideas and demonstrations, but that's just not enough.
What does a climate neutral city look like?
We're looking at exactly that question. What does a climate or a climate resilient and a zero emissions by 2030 city look like? And it's going to look different in different places. So Perth, which is a resources city, although a lot of the resources are elsewhere in Western Australia, and you can start looking at, well, where do you draw your system's boundaries and how do you define that? I think it's important for it to be broad, and I think it's important to be global. And I think it's important to be able to look at those differences and to understand it. So my answer to that is I could imagine what it could be a lot of public transport and cycling. It can be a lot of green space. It can be fossil free. Look, that's all fine, but I think it's much, much more complicated than that. I think we need to start to understand that there's a heterogeneity or a difference in the way that our cities look like. That's where it gets interesting as a research perspective. If you want to say carbon, that's okay. If you want to talk climate neutral or carbon neutral, that's fine. But I think there's a much greater complexity in it. That's where our research is getting quite interesting.
2030 may sound like it's a while away, but it's really not.
2020 sounded like it was miles away. No, we're mere months away from it.
So is it really possible to make such great change in that space of time when we've obviously discussed just in this conversation some barriers to that happening? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think so. I remember when I was at Chalmers University in Gothenburg. In terms of energy, they're pretty far down the track. With triple glazing, well-insulated buildings, electric buses. We moved very quickly on to the next challenge, which I think is the more difficult one, in a sense, going to be our big challenge for humanity, and that is the whole material consumerism, resource use. I think the actual climate side of it and the energy side of it, I think we can do for 2030. I think the big challenge we have for, say, 2050 is the increase in use of resources in our buildings, in our societies. The reality is, if you look for a population on Earth of, say, 10 million, 2050, to really be able to live within our planetary boundaries in terms of resource material use, we need to start thinking about reducing that by about a factor of 10 globally. If we're going to have countries, India, China, Africa, continue to become more prosperous and using more materials. So I think we have to meet this challenge for 2030. I think it's quite doable. And then I think there'll be the next challenge, which probably will go beyond my research. But this I think for me is quite doable. There's a political will. It varies around the world, the way this is regarded. But when you start to show what can be done, it's surprising how quickly people can react to good change.
We've obviously spoken in a global sense, but how does Australia actually rate? How do we rate and how are we on track for the future?
Yeah, so there's sort of two sides to that question. How do we rate in terms of CO2 emissions? Not great. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's climate that is a problem for Australia. No question about it. That's starting to be pessimistic. But if you look at Australia as a country of opportunity, the whole solar situation, Australia has a huge possibility to be a solar energy powerhouse.
Opportunities are endless.
Yeah, there are huge opportunities here. We will be mobilising the universities. What I find coming here is that the whole meeting of universities and society and industry is perhaps not as far progressed as has been the case in Europe and even before that in America. But that's changing very quickly. There's a realization by universities that we have to integrate in the types of projects we do. So the sort of projects I talk about is what we should be doing. We've got some of the best university researchers in the world and some of the great minds. It's just bringing them together and bringing them together with society and industry to say, well, now we want to solve this issue. And then it becomes eminently solvable. I think rather than sort of saying, well, we're the best or we're worst in certain things, there's huge opportunities here in Australia.
Just leading on from Jess's question, given that WA is not part of the national grid for the electricity network, how does WA rate in terms of mitigating climate change?
So your question is about the grid, which is the Southwest Integrated System, which is separate from the NEM, which is the whole energy system over east. That is, again, a challenge. You've got a grid that's basically the size of the UK grid, but with about 2 million people as against 60, 70 million. So it's expensive and it's challenging. It's a capacity market, so monopoly in terms of... So the challenge has been, I would say, the actual transformation that we're seeing at the present time in terms of individuals putting solar on their roof. Started at least 5 to 10 years ago. There hasn't been a transformation of this type for 100 years. So the last time there was that type of transformation was when the Perth Gas Company were taken over by the Perth Government Authority and turned into the electricity company that has been built on a model of large-scale generation and distribution and then delivered to homes. That is radically changing and has been doing so for the last 5 years or so. So it's one of the first places in the world to undergo a transformation to a more decentralized, local I mean, rooftop generation. You don't get much more decentralized than that on people's homes. The challenge will be, and we're doing quite a lot of research on this at the moment, will be how to integrate batteries. Are we talking batteries in people's homes to be able to store the energy, the solar you produce during the day, and use it in the evenings, in the morning? So battery is certainly a solution. Or does it make sense to have a community battery? We're doing some experiments on that at the White Gum Valley with a 700
Or a really
kilowatt hour.
big battery,
Or
like
a really
pumped
big battery,
hydro.
Yes, it could be a pumped hydro, or it could be large scale batteries out in the grid. But it can also be batteries on 2 wheels and 4 wheels and many wheels. So everything from the electric bike to the car. We just bought an electric car ourselves. We connected into the house.
Wow.
It's not fully electric; it's a hybrid, which means, of course, we use more electricity rather than fossil fuel, which is a good thing. But that is going to change the very nature of home integration of batteries. Is going to change the very nature of the grid. So I think we're seeing another optimistic development there, and that is that with smart metering, we're now able to look at
when
electricity use down to 5 seconds, and perhaps even down to 1 second soon. So there will be the possibility for demand response, be able to better control in the network, but also for the homeowner to have their own sort of management system and start to sort of both in the home and perhaps across the grid as well. So although it's a very challenging time for the bigger companies who are dealing with this, it's actually quite an exciting time. We have just great meetings with Synergy and Western Power where we sit and say, well, what do we do next? So I'm, again, quite optimistic here. I think this will be solved. There will be changes with time, and there's an experimentation going on with how we use our energy and what individuals can and can't do in terms of sort of local use or whether it can be traded and all the rest of it. I think that as the whole sort of digital services, twinning the cities, visualization of our cities emerges more and more, and this is a lot of our research, I think we're going to see huge opportunities for improving that actual grid system.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about today's topic, get in touch by following the links in our show notes. Bye for now.